The elevator climbed 42 floors through the steel and glass towers of Victoria Island, carrying Adunni Adebayo toward another ~1 million deal. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Lagos sprawled endlessly, a chaotic symphony of yellow Danfos, gleaming SUVs, and street vendors weaving through traffic that moved like thick palm oil. At 28, she had built TechFlow from a cramped boys' quarters apartment in Surulere into Nigeria's fastest-growing fintech company, with an office commanding breathtaking views of the lagoon where container ships queued like patient elephants. Her phone buzzed with notifications from Bloomberg, TechCrunch, and local tech blogs celebrating her latest funding round. 200 million naira in Series B funding, a figure that would have seemed impossible when she was writing code by candlelight during NEPA blackouts 5 years ago. Now international investors flew to Lagos specifically to meet her, drawn by her revolutionary mobile banking platform that was finally bringing Nigeria's unbanked population into the digital economy. The irony wasn't lost on her that while she helped millions access modern financial services, her own family still insisted she needed their permission to access happiness. Today's pitch meeting would change everything, she was certain. The American venture capitalist arriving this afternoon represented more than money. He represented validation that her dreams could transcend the traditional expectations weighing on her shoulders like heavy Gelly headwrap. Marcus Richardson stepped out of the Uber Black at 1004 housing estate, his designer suit slightly wrinkled from the 14-hour flight from Silicon Valley. Despite his exhaustion, his blue eyes were sharp with the intensity that had made him legendary in venture capital circles. At 35, he had turned 3 startups into unicorns and was now hunting for the next big disruption in emerging markets. Lagos wasn't his usual hunting ground. He preferred the familiar territory of San Francisco coffee shops and Austin tech conferences, but Adunni's numbers were impossible to ignore. The TechFlow offices buzzed with nervous energy as news spread that the American investor had arrived. Adunni watched from her corner office as Marcus navigated the reception area, noting how he politely declined the offered cola nut while managing not to appear rude. His research was thorough. She could tell from the way he asked about regulatory frameworks and mobile penetration rates rather than the usual questions about corruption and infrastructure that most foreign investors fixated on. When she finally stood to greet him, extending her hand in a firm businesswoman's shake, the electric jolt of connection surprised them both. This wasn't just another pitch meeting. This was the moment 2 ambitious hearts recognized their match across an ocean of cultural difference. As Lagos traffic hummed 42 floors below, neither realized they were standing at the precipice of a love that would challenge everything they thought they knew about tradition, ambition, and the price of choosing your own destiny. The pitch lasted 3 hours, spilling from the conference room to a quiet cafe in Ikoyi where they continued discussing market penetration over suya and Chapman cocktails. Marcus found himself leaning forward, captivated not just by Adunni's business acumen but by the way her eyes lit up when she explained how her platform could help a trader in Alaba Market send money to family in Kano instantly. Her passion was infectious, her vision breathtaking. By the time evening painted Lagos in shades of amber and gold, he knew he wanted to invest in her company and, though he barely admitted it to himself, in whatever was growing between them. Adunni felt the shift too. The way professional admiration was blooming into something more dangerous. Marcus asked thoughtful questions about user experience design and spoke knowledgeably about mobile-first architecture, but she caught him watching her lips when she spoke, noticed how his hand lingered when passing her documents. When he suggested dinner to continue their discussions, she agreed despite knowing it crossed the invisible line between business and pleasure. They chose a rooftop restaurant overlooking the lagoon, where soft jazz mixed with the distant sounds of Lagos nightlife, and conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine he ordered. As the city lights twinkled below like scattered diamonds, Adunni realized she was falling for this brilliant American whose enthusiasm for her dreams matched her own ambition. The danger of that realization thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Sunday meant returning to Ibadan, to the sprawling family compound where her grandfather's portrait still watched over Sunday rice and the family matriarch, Mama Agba, held court under the ancient Irako tree. The 3-hour journey from Lagos always felt like traveling backward through time, from glass towers and broadband internet to red earth roads and conversations conducted in rapid-fire Yoruba that carried the weight of centuries. Adunni's Mercedes navigated between Okadas and articulated trucks, passing roadside markets where women balanced impossible loads on their heads with graceful ease that no Silicon Valley yoga class could teach. The compound erupted in its usual chaos when she arrived. Children running between buildings, aunties comparing whose daughter was more successful, uncles debating politics over bottles of Star beer. But today felt different. Mama Agba's eyes, sharp despite her 87 years, seemed to pierce through Adunni's careful composure as if sensing secrets. "Adunni, my child," the old woman said in Yoruba, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had arranged marriages for 3 generations. "Your father says you've been too busy for proper suitors. A woman your age should have given us grandchildren by now." The familiar pressure settled on Adunni's shoulders like a heavy shawl. Around the compound, cousins her age shepherded children while their husbands lounged in plastic chairs, and she felt the unspoken question hanging in the humid air. Why was their brilliant daughter still unmarried at 28? If only they knew about Marcus, about the way her heart raced when his messages arrived, about the impossible choice already forming in her mind. Back in Lagos Monday morning, Adunni found roses on her desk, not the dramatic 24 that shouted romance, but a careful arrangement of 5 white blooms with a note, "For brilliant partnerships, M." The gesture was perfectly calibrated, professional enough to maintain plausible deniability while intimate enough to make her pulse quicken. Her assistant, Kemi, raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though her knowing smile spoke volumes. Marcus had sent similar flowers to 3 other portfolio companies, the note explained, but Adunni suspected hers were the only ones chosen personally rather than ordered by an assistant. Their official meetings multiplied. Due diligence sessions, market analysis reviews, regulatory discussions, but the real conversation happened in stolen moments. A text about market volatility that turned into philosophical debates about risk and reward. Coffee meetings that stretched into lunch, then dinner, then long walks along the lagoon where container ships moved like sleeping giants through water that reflected the setting sun. Marcus was brilliant in ways that challenged her, funny in ways that surprised her, and ambitious in ways that matched her own relentless drive. When he kissed her for the first time, under the lights of Banana Island's exclusive waterfront, she tasted possibility and danger in equal measure. They were crossing a line that could complicate everything: business relationships, family expectations, visa applications, and the careful balance she'd maintained between her traditional roots and modern ambitions. But as Lagos sparkled around them like a city-sized jewelry box, consequence felt very far away. 3 weeks into what they carefully called their extended partnership discussions, Marcus and Adunni had developed their own secret language. Business dinners became excuses for intimate conversations about dreams and fears. Morning conference calls stretched into evening video chats about everything except term sheets and equity percentages. He told her about growing up in Portland, about parents who taught him that success meant creating value for others, about the loneliness of achieving everything he'd wanted professionally while his personal life remained empty. She shared stories of coding through university power outages, of proving herself in a male-dominated tech scene, of carrying her family's hopes while harboring dreams they might never understand. Marcus extended his Lagos stay indefinitely, claiming he needed to conduct thorough market research. His hotel suite at the Four Points became their sanctuary, a neutral space between her corporate office and family obligations where they could simply be Adunni and Marcus rather than CEO and investor, Nigerian daughter and American businessman. They ordered room service and debated the future of African fintech, watched Nollywood movies while he asked endless questions about cultural references, made love with the desperate intensity of people who knew their time might be borrowed. When he suggested she visit San Francisco to meet his partners and see their operations, her immediate yes surprised them both. The invitation represented more than business. It was a bridge between worlds, a test of whether their connection could survive transplantation from Lagos soil to Silicon Valley concrete. As she applied for her visa, Adunni wondered if she was planning a business trip or fleeing toward a future her family would never forgive. San Francisco overwhelmed Adunni's senses: the impossible hills, the startup energy crackling through coffee shops like electricity, the casual conversations about disrupting entire industries over artisanal toast. Marcus's world was revealed in layers. The converted warehouse office where his team analyzed global market trends, the Nob Hill apartment with its minimalist furniture and panoramic views, the network of brilliant misfits who spoke in acronyms and measured success in user acquisition metrics. His partners welcomed her warmly. Their enthusiasm for tech flowed genuine and infectious. "You're building something revolutionary," declared Sarah Chen, the firm's managing partner, over lunch in Palo Alto. "We want to be part of that story." But it was the personal moments that captured her heart completely. Marcus cooking breakfast in his kitchen while explaining his investment philosophy, the way he listened when she called her team back in Lagos, how naturally he included her in his circle of friends without making her feel like an exotic curiosity. They hiked through Muir Woods among redwoods that had stood for centuries, and she felt a peace she'd never experienced. The freedom to simply be herself without carrying anyone else's expectations. When he asked her to extend her stay, she agreed immediately, pushing aside the growing mountain of missed calls from home. For 2 weeks, she lived as if family obligations and cultural expectations were distant thunder rather than approaching storms. Reality felt negotiable in this place where 20-somethings became billionaires and innovation was the only tradition that mattered. Only when Mama Agba's urgent voicemail mentioned visiting suitors did the spell begin to crack. The first sign of trouble was her father's tone during their weekly call. Stiff, formal, the voice he used with business associates rather than his beloved daughter. "Adunni, people are talking," Chief Adebayo said carefully. "Your absence has been noted. Mama Agba asks questions I cannot answer." She deflected with work excuses, promises to visit soon, but could hear the concern beneath his diplomatic words. Her extended American stay was being interpreted as exactly what it was, an emotional investment that threatened carefully laid traditional plans. Marcus sensed the shift immediately. Their conversations became strained as she juggled time zones and family expectations, taking increasingly frantic calls from Lagos during their dinner dates. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked finally, finding her crying on his apartment balcony after a particularly heated conversation with her aunt about wedding planning for a ceremony she'd never agreed to attend. The truth spilled out in broken fragments. The childhood betrothal arranged between families when she was 12, the financial interdependence that made defiance costly, the weight of being the first university graduate in her lineage and therefore responsible for elevating everyone's fortunes. Marcus listened with growing horror as she described Damilola, her intended husband, a perfectly decent banker whose greatest crime was being chosen for her rather than chosen by her. "You can just say no," he said, with the confident naivety of someone raised to believe individual choice trumped collective obligation. Her bitter laugh taught him his first lesson about the difference between American independence and African interconnectedness. Lagos International Airport felt like stepping back into a pressure cooker after the cool rationality of Silicon Valley. The familiar chaos, hustling taxi drivers, family members arguing over luggage, the humid air thick with exhaust and ambition, reminded Adunni how much she'd changed during her month away. Marcus had insisted on flying back with her, despite her warnings about the complications his presence would create. "We'll figure it out together," he'd said, holding her hand during the turbulent flight over the Atlantic. But now, watching him navigate the aggressive efficiency of Nigerian customs officials, she wondered if love could survive the collision between his optimism and her reality. Her apartment in Lekki felt foreign after weeks of San Francisco minimalism. Too much color, too many family photos, too many reminders of the complex web of relationships that defined her existence. Marcus marveled at everything. The generator that kicked on during power outages, the gate man who greeted him with formal curiosity, the way her domestic staff moved with efficient familiarity through routines he couldn't decode. They had one night together before she had to face her family, one evening to pretend their relationship existed in a vacuum rather than in the crowded space of cultural expectation and family politics. Over jollof rice and wine on her balcony, watching Legos sparkle below like a circuit board, they made plans that felt increasingly fragile. Tomorrow she would drive to Ibadan and attempt to introduce the idea of Marcus gently, strategically, hopefully. Tonight they held each other like people bracing for impact. Mama Agba's voice on the phone was deceptively calm. "Adunni, my child, come home this weekend. There are things we need to discuss." The words carried undertones that made Adunni's stomach clench with familiar dread, the same tone that had preceded lectures about appropriate behavior, suitable friends, proper priorities. Her grandmother had clearly heard something, seen something, or simply felt the disturbance in the family force that came when one of her children stepped too far outside prescribed boundaries. The drive to Ibadan felt longer than usual, each kilometer adding weight to the conversation she knew awaited her. Marcus had wanted to come to meet her family properly and ask for their blessing like the honorable man he was, but Adunni knew the gesture would be seen as presumptuous rather than respectful. This was reconnaissance, not diplomacy. The family compound looked the same. Red earth courtyard, whitewashed buildings, children playing football with a makeshift ball, but felt different, charged with an expectation she couldn't name. Mama Agba sat under the iroko tree as always, but her usually warm smile was replaced by the neutral expression that meant serious business. Around the compound, aunties and cousins moved with the studied casualness that indicated everyone knew something important was about to happen. When the old woman gestured for Adunni to sit beside her, the entire extended family seemed to hold its breath. "My daughter," Mama Agba began in Yoruba, her voice carrying 6 decades of authority, "it is time we talked about your future." The conversation unfolded with the terrible precision of a ritual Mama Agba had performed dozens of times before. She spoke of family honor, of the promises made between the Adebayo and Adebowale families when Adunni was still a child with gap teeth and ambitious dreams. Damilola had waited patiently through her university years, her early career struggles, her rise to prominence, understanding that a woman of substance needed time to develop. But patience, even virtuous patience, had limits. His family was asking questions. Other suitable wives were being considered. The time for childhood indulgences was over. "There are rumors," Mama Agba said carefully, "of an American man. People talk, Adunni. They say you were seen together in Lagos, that you traveled to his country." The words hung in the humid air like a challenge. Adunni felt the weight of dozens of eyes, cousins, aunties, uncles, all waiting for her response. To deny would be a lie that everyone would recognize. To confirm would be an admission of betrayal that could shatter the careful balance of family harmony. "Mama," she began carefully, "my business requires international partnerships. I cannot build a global company by limiting myself to local connections." It was technically true but felt like cowardice. The old woman studied her with eyes that had seen 3 generations grow up, love, marry, and find their places in the intricate dance of family obligation. "Business partnerships," Mama Agba repeated slowly, "do not require sharing hotel rooms. Choose carefully, my daughter. Some paths lead away from family forever. And a woman without family is like a tree without roots. She may grow tall, but the first strong wind will topple her." Back in Lagos, Marcus waited with the patient anxiety of someone who understood his entire future hung on conversations happening in a language he couldn't speak among people he'd never met. Adunni returned from Ibadan hollow-eyed and quiet, carrying the weight of an ultimatum that offered no good choices. 3 months. That was the timeline Mama Agba had given her. 3 months to end her foreign entanglement, and commit to the marriage that would secure both families' futures, or face the consequences of choosing individual desire over collective responsibility. The consequences were spelled out with devastating clarity. Complete financial isolation from family resources that currently supported not just her but 3 cousins in university, 2 unemployed uncles, and her grandfather's medical care. Beyond money lay something more precious: belonging. To choose Marcus meant accepting exile from the intricate web of relationships that had sustained her through every challenge, every triumph, every moment of doubt. "They're bluffing," Marcus said when she finally explained the choice, but they both knew better. Nigerian families didn't make empty threats about disownment. They made promises as solid as the ancient Iroko tree where Mama Agba held court. That night, Adunni lay awake calculating impossible equations. Love versus duty, individual happiness versus collective welfare, the American dream versus African reality. The numbers never balanced, no matter how she rearranged them. Every choice required a sacrifice too great to bear, yet standing still meant losing everything anyway. Damilola Adebayo appeared at her office unannounced on a Tuesday morning. His presence as inevitable as Lagos traffic and twice as complicated. He moved through her reception area with the easy confidence of someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. His tailored suit and gold watch speaking the language of established success. At 32, he had built a respectable career in investment banking, owned properties in Lekki and Abuja, and possessed the kind of steady reliability that mothers dreamed of for their daughters. He was also handsome in the classical Yoruba way, tall, dark-skinned, with a kind of strong jaw that looked good in family photographs. "Adunni," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk as if they'd scheduled this meeting months ago. "I think it's time we talked." His voice carried the patience of someone who had waited years for this conversation and could wait longer if necessary, but preferred not to. He spoke about their family's expectations with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing quarterly projections, acknowledging her American friend, with the diplomatic dismissal of a minor complication. "I understand you need to explore your options," he said magnanimously. "I've always admired your independence. But surely you see that some traditions exist because they work." He painted a picture of their future with professional precision. A merger of compatible families, shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of partnership that would benefit everyone involved. It was a perfectly reasonable proposal from a perfectly suitable man, and Adunni found herself searching for flaws that didn't exist. The tragedy wasn't that Damilola was wrong for her. It was that he was exactly what everyone expected her to want, and what she might have wanted herself if she'd never tasted the possibility of choosing for herself. The pressure mounted from all directions like Lagos traffic during rush hour, inescapable, overwhelming, and slowly suffocating. Marcus threw himself into due diligence with the desperate energy of someone who believed that if he could just make the business case compelling enough, love would naturally follow. He brought in additional partners, structured increasingly favorable terms, and painted visions of TechFlow's global expansion that made Adunni's head spin with possibility. His enthusiasm was infectious but also exhausting. He seemed to believe that American efficiency and determination could solve any problem, including centuries of Yoruba tradition. Meanwhile, family pressure intensified with surgical precision. Aunties called daily with subtle reminders about biological clocks and suitable marriages. Cousins shared photos of their children with pointed comments about the joys of motherhood. Her father began including Damilola in business conversations, gradually integrating him into the family network with the smooth efficiency of someone who had managed complex negotiations his entire career. The strategy was brilliant in its subtlety. Rather than demanding Adunni choose Damilola, they were simply making him indispensable to her daily life. When her company needed banking services, Damilola appeared with favorable terms. When family events required planning, he volunteered his assistance. When Adunni felt overwhelmed by competing pressures, he offered calm, practical support without judgment or ultimatums. It was emotional warfare disguised as helpfulness, and she found herself grudgingly appreciating both the strategy and the man implementing it. If only choosing him felt like victory rather than surrender. Marcus's solution was characteristically American. Remove the problem by changing the context. "Come to San Francisco permanently," he proposed over dinner at their favorite Lagos restaurant, the one where they'd shared their first kiss months ago. "We'll relocate your operations, bring your core team, build something bigger than either of us imagined." His vision was intoxicating. TechFlow as a truly global platform, Adunni as a recognized leader in the international fintech space, their love story becoming a symbol of innovation transcending borders. He'd already researched visa requirements, identified potential office spaces, and begun conversations with California-based engineers who could accelerate her platform's development. The offer was everything she'd dreamed of professionally and personally: escape from impossible choices, validation on the world's biggest stage, a love that felt like coming home to herself. But as Marcus painted pictures of their future life in San Francisco, Adunni felt the pull of everything she'd be leaving behind. Not just family obligations, but the rhythm of Lagos life that matched her heartbeat, the satisfaction of solving uniquely African problems with homegrown solutions, the knowledge that her success lifted an entire community rather than just herself. Could she build something truly meaningful from a distance? Or would TechFlow become just another Silicon Valley success story with African origins but American soul? That night, she stood on her Lekki balcony listening to Lagos hum beneath her. Generators, car horns, late-night conversations, the sound of a city that never truly slept. In San Francisco, she could have Marcus and professional recognition beyond her wildest dreams. But she might lose the very thing that made her innovations meaningful. Deep, unbreakable connection to the people and problems she was trying to serve. Mama Agba's health crisis arrived like a thunderclap, sudden and transformative. The call came at 3 a.m. Lagos time. The old woman had collapsed during evening prayers. Her blood pressure spiking to dangerous levels that had the doctors in University College Hospital shaking their heads gravely. Adunni drove through empty Lagos streets with her heart hammering, Marcus beside her offering comfort she couldn't quite receive. At the hospital, she found her entire extended family gathered in the waiting room, their faces drawn with a shared fear that comes when the family matriarch's mortality becomes suddenly, terrifyingly real. For 3 days, Mama Agba drifted between consciousness and sleep while doctors worked to stabilize her condition. During those endless hours in sterile hallways, Adunni felt the full weight of what losing her grandmother would mean. This woman had raised 5 children through Nigerian civil war, built a successful trading business from nothing, and guided 3 generations through the complex dance of tradition and modernity. She was the keeper of family stories, the arbiter of disputes, the living link to ancestors whose blood flowed in Adunni's veins. When the old woman finally opened her eyes and asked weakly for Adunni to come close, the words she whispered carried the authority of a dying wish. "Promise me you will not let our family scatter like leaves in the wind. Promise me you will remember who you are." The request wasn't specifically about Marcus or Damilola, but everyone in the room understood its implications. Some promises, once made to a grandmother's dying breath, became unbreakable bonds that transcended personal desire. Ironically, Mama Agba's recovery coincided with the biggest opportunity in TechFlow's history. Goldman Sachs wanted to lead a Series C round that would value her company at over £1 billion, but only if she could demonstrate international scalability by establishing meaningful American operations within 6 months. The timeline was aggressive, the requirement specific, and the opportunity transformational. Marcus had clearly been working behind the scenes, using his connections to create exactly the scenario that would force her hand toward California. "This is it," he said, pacing her office with the nervous energy of someone who had bet everything on a single outcome. "This is bigger than Series B, bigger than anything we imagined. But they want to see American operations, American customers, American revenue streams. You have to be there, Adunni. You have to be on the ground building relationships, understanding markets." His excitement was infectious but also felt like manipulation, creating circumstances where choosing him became choosing professional success, while choosing family meant abandoning her company's greatest opportunity. The math was undeniable. Goldman Sachs could transform TechFlow from regional success to global phenomenon, but only if she was willing to transplant herself permanently to Silicon Valley soil. That evening, Damilola appeared at her apartment with flowers and a quiet question. "When will you stop running from happiness?" He wasn't talking about Marcus or San Francisco. He was talking about the contentment that came from accepting life's rhythms rather than constantly fighting against them. His presence felt like an anchor in increasingly turbulent waters, offering stability while Marcus offered excitement, certainty while Marcus promised adventure. The traditional Yoruba wedding planning began whether Adunni agreed or not, rolling forward with the inexorable momentum of family expectation and cultural practice. Aunties appeared with swatches of fabric for Aso-ebi selections, discussing color schemes and photographer recommendations as if her participation was merely ceremonial. Damilola's family sent representatives to formalize engagement discussions, their gifts of kola nuts and schnapps carrying centuries of symbolic weight. Even Mama Agba, still weak from her hospital stay, insisted on being wheeled to fabric stores to oversee preparations for what she called our family's most important celebration. The irony was bitter. While her personal life was being orchestrated according to traditional script, her professional life was demanding increasingly radical departures from everything familiar. Goldman Sachs required quarterly meetings in New York, strategic partnerships with American payment processors, and regulatory compliance across multiple international jurisdictions. Marcus worked tirelessly to support these requirements, but each success bound her more tightly to American business cycles and Silicon Valley expectations. She found herself living in two completely incompatible timelines, one moving toward wedding ceremonies that celebrated community continuity, another racing toward IPO preparations that would require permanent relocation to California. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. During family meetings about marriage arrangements, she smiled and nodded while mentally calculating international wire transfer protocols. During business calls with American investors, she provided brilliant strategic insights while her heart ached for the Lagos rhythms she'd be abandoning. Neither version of herself felt entirely authentic anymore. The crisis arrived during what should have been a celebration. TechFlow won African FinTech Company of the Year at the Lagos Tech Awards, with Adunni delivering an acceptance speech that brought the audience to their feet. Marcus watched from the front row with pride radiating from his face, already mentally drafting press releases that would introduce her to American business media. But in the VIP section, Damilola sat with her father and uncles, their presence a reminder that some victories came with prices yet to be calculated. After the ceremony, two competing celebrations unfolded simultaneously. Marcus organized a champagne reception at the Eco Hotel, inviting Lagos tech elite and international investors to toast TechFlow's future. Meanwhile, her family hosted a traditional feast at the family compound in Ibadan, honoring her achievement with jollof rice, live music, and speeches that emphasized how her success reflected the entire family's values and support. Adunni spent the evening driving between celebrations, changing from evening gown to traditional wrapper, switching between English and Yoruba, smiling until her face hurt while her heart fractured. At the hotel, Marcus announced Goldman Sachs' final offer, 2 billion naira for 40% equity, contingent on her relocating to San Francisco within 90 days. At the compound, Mama Agba announced that wedding invitations would be printed next week, with a ceremony scheduled for the end of the rainy season. Both announcements were presented as fait accompli, decisions made by people who loved her but couldn't see past their own visions of her happiness. Standing between her two worlds, Adunni finally understood that some choices couldn't be postponed indefinitely, and that sometimes love means disappointing people you care about. Dawn broke over Lagos Lagoon as Adunni sat in her office, watching container ships navigate toward Apapa port with steady, purposeful movement. Two signed documents lay on her desk: Goldman Sachs investment agreement requiring her San Francisco relocation, and formal marriage proposal papers from Damilola's family. Both represented futures she could envision, lives she could live, versions of herself she could become. But only one felt like home. Marcus arrived first, coffee and croissants in hand, ready to celebrate what he assumed was their shared victory. His enthusiasm filled the room like sunlight, infectious and warm and completely American in its assumption that dreams achieved were simply dreams bigger. "We'll start with a small team," he said, spreading floor plans across her desk. "Maybe 6 people initially, then scale as we build market presence. Your visa interview is Thursday." His confidence was absolute, his love unquestionable, his vision of their future painted in Silicon Valley gold. When Damilola appeared an hour later, he brought different gifts: understanding wrapped in patience, acceptance bundled with respect, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you belong. "Damilola," she said finally, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest, "I cannot marry you. Not because you are not wonderful, but because wonderful should not be settled for." To Marcus, whose face crumpled like paper in rain, she said words that cost her everything. "I love you completely, but love is not always enough to bridge every gap." She chose the hardest path, staying in Lagos alone, rejecting both the easy traditional route and the exciting international opportunity, keeping TechFlow as a proudly Nigerian company serving African problems with African solutions. It was a choice that disappointed everyone who loved her, but it was authentically hers. As both men left her office, carrying their separate heartbreaks toward separate futures, Adunni turned back to the window. The Lagos she loved sprawled below, chaotic, challenging, impossible, and perfectly, frustratingly home.